All right, let's get started with the next chapter, which is on political economy. One empirical observation before we start, I've learned over the last decade that if there's one thing that's true is that it's Lizzo's world and we just live in it. So for those of you who appropriately recognize the brilliance of Lizzo and have a couple $100 to spare, she'll be playing Friday night at TD Garden. I can testify that she puts on an amazing show. Indeed, one of my few claims to fame is actually, I discovered her very early. My wife and I first saw her at about a 200-person venue when she was just getting started, and we followed her career on the way up, and are very excited to be going to see her next Friday night. So if any of you looking for something fun to do next Friday night and have a couple $100 to spare, it's Lizzo puts on a truly epic show. So I highly recommend it. All right, so today we're going to talk about why governments do what they do. The sort of the fourth question of public finance, and really in some sense kind of unfairly the kind of overriding question. We always talk about cute stories about governments doing interesting things and why they do them. This is the sort of one time we're going to put some formalization to that discussion. You can and we do teach entire courses on political economy, and I recommend you take them if you're interested in this topic. So we're going to give it sort of relatively short shrift here, but so be it. The motivating example in the chapter is actually involves someone whose name's been in the news a lot, Kristen Sinema, and example of what happened in Arizona. So in Arizona, there were two politicians, Martha McSally and Kristen Sinema. Martha McSally was a dyed-in-the-wool, is a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, who in particular is very anti clean energy policy. She's voted repeatedly against clean energy policy, and she opposed President Obama's Clean Power Plan. Meanwhile, this Kristen Sinema, who rose to fame as an environmentalist, she was sort of rose to fame as sort of someone whose main issue she cared about was the environment. In 2018, they ran against each other, and Sinema won. But then in 2019, McSally got appointed to take over John McCain's seat. She's since lost, but basically, Sinema and McSally both came from Arizona, came from very opposing viewpoints, yet over the 2 years they started being in Congress together, they started voting more similarly. So in particular, Sinema, well known now for her sort of moving very quickly along the political spectrum, started voting against clean energy plans, and McSally started voting for clean energy initiatives. So what explains this? You've got a longtime opponent of clean energy, a longtime supporter of clean energy starting to vote similarly. What explains it is they both want to be senator from Arizona. So they're moving towards the middle, which represented the voters of Arizona. And this is an example of the kind of behavior we think is explained by the theories of political economy. And that's what we'll focus on in this chapter. Okay, so I'll talk about political economy now. We'll probably finish it up next time. This is obviously an increasingly difficult subject to talk about in rational terms. I'll teach you material which seems pretty out of date in terms of the way politics has gone in the US in the last 5 or 6 years, but that doesn't mean it's not important to understand it and to think about how it applies and what lessons we can draw for thinking about perhaps even bringing America towards a more rational political future. I also realize these are topics which people in this room may have different views, and I hope people will air them. Especially if people's views don't actually line up with mine. I hope we can get an interesting discussion going here around politics and around these issues, because it really is so central to where we're heading as a country. So I hope people won't be shy and can talk about what they think about these issues. So that said, with that speech in mind, we're actually going to back up and talk with a fairly abstract and theoretical beginning. So the way we're going to go through political economy is in sort of 3 steps. We're first going to imagine the simplest possible world where all political decisions are made by unanimous consent. Okay? We're then going to say, well, look, that's unrealistic. No political system ever operates that way. Instead, the sort of principle of political systems operates on the principle of direct democracy and the notion the people vote over what government should do. And it doesn't have to be unanimous, but rather the majority decides what's to be done. But then we'll say, well, in fact, that's not really what we do in America, with rare exception. Mostly what we do is we elect representatives and they represent our views. And that's called representative democracy. So then turn to asking about how representative democracy works. And then finally, we'll turn to the topic of government failure. The point I made in the first lecture, that just because the private sector gets it wrong doesn't mean the government will get it right, and how governments fail in various ways. Okay, so let's start with the unanimous consent model. So here we're asking, okay, let's think about a world where the government can decide what to do based on the unanimous consent of its citizens. And the government does through a system we're going to call Lindahl pricing, named for a Swedish economist. Lindahl pricing, which is a system where basically Lindahl was Swedish economist who laid out a system under which you could implement the Samuelson condition with perfect unanimous consent. So Lindahl laid out the world where we could get marginal cost equals sum of marginal rates of substitution with perfect unanimous consent. Okay? And basically, the key to Lindahl's approach is to essentially say, look, we're going to essentially, to get the valuations of people, we're going to ask them. We're going to ask them in a way which gets them to reveal their true demands. Then we'll aggregate up those demands, and we'll use that to measure the social demand for public goods. Okay? So for example, let's imagine that we have two public goods, a public good and some private good. The public good is fireworks. And let's say to make life easy, there's a constant marginal cost of $1. So public good fireworks with a marginal cost of $1. Now let's say we have two people in society, Ava and Jack, two of my kids. Remember, the fireworks must be the same for Ava and Jack. They're a public good. Okay. So here's how Lindahl would make the world work. Lindahl would say, let's do the following. The government's going to announce a set of tax prices. The government's going to say, look, for every firework that's shot off, I'm going to charge Ava X and Jack X. Let's start with 50-50. So let's say each firework costs $1. So the government announces, look, I'm going to charge each of you 50 cents for fireworks. And then each individual reports how many fireworks they want at that price. So I go to each individual, I say, look, 50 cents a firework, how many do you want? I say it to Ava, I say it to Jack. Then I come back and say, you know what? How about 25 cents a firework, 75 cents a firework? And I basically trace out their demand curve. I trace out their demand curve as in figure 9.1. So by asking Ava and Jack how many fireworks they want at each price, I trace out their demand curve or their willingness to pay for fireworks. So I see here that Ava is willing to pay much less than Jack for the marginal firework. Ava, for the 50th firework, will only pay 50 cents. Jack will pay $1.50 for the 50th firework. Okay? So I've got their marginal willingnesses to pay. Then what I do is I simply add those up. I say, well, for example, 50 fireworks, Ava's willing to pay 50 cents. Jack's willing to pay $1.50. If I shoot up 50 fireworks, they both get them. Samuelson says it's the sum of marginal rates of substitution that matter. So I add those up. I get an aggregate willingness to pay, which is the blue line in panel C. I see where that equals marginal cost, and that's how many fireworks I choose. So I say that on aggregate, I get the blue demand curve in panel C. The marginal cost is $1. And so I choose 75 fireworks. How do I pay for them? Well, I go back to Ava and Jack and say, well, look, Ava, for 75 fireworks, you're willing to pay 25 cents. So give me 25 cents a fireworks, 25 times 75. Jack, you said for 75 fireworks, you're willing to pay 75 cents each. So give me 75 cents for each of 75 fireworks. Okay. And so basically, I charge Jack and Ava. I charge Ava 25 cents and Jack 75 cents for each of 75 fireworks. And it works. Both Ava and Jack are happy because I'm charging their marginal willingness to pay. Maybe I charge them $24.99, 0.2499 and 0.7499 cents or something like that. So they're a little bit happy. Okay. So basically, they're happy. They are each paying what it's worth to them, and we've achieved the Samuelson equilibrium because we're providing the number of fireworks which represents the sum of the marginal rate substitution. Okay, we're charging them a price that makes them happy for 75 fireworks, and at that price, society is demanding 75 fireworks. So we've implemented the Samuelson solution. Full stop. Yeah. Well, this mechanism actually requires three things. Okay, the first is what we call preference revelation, or what you might call truth telling. Remember, the key to economics, the key to why economists make so much money is to make up fancy words for simple ideas. Okay, Preference revelation, or what you may call telling the truth, is simply that it requires that people tell the truth. But in fact, there's an incentive to lie, because you're going to pay what you say it's worth to you. Yet there's a free rider issue, which is if you say it's worth less, you pay less, but both of you get fewer fireworks. Okay, so think of it this way. Imagine that Jack lied and said his preferences were the same as Ava's. Well, in that case, what would happen? We'd end up with two curves that look like we panel A. We'd end up, if we did that at $1 firework, we'd end up with 50 fireworks, and each would pay 50 cents for them. Okay, with 50 fireworks, and Jack would pay, and Jack and Ava would pay $25. Okay. Now think about where that leaves Ava. Okay, and think about where it leaves Jack. Okay, for Ava, okay, she now pays more, $25. She used to pay 25 cents for each of 75 fireworks. So Ava, in the first case, under the Lindahl equilibrium, Ava paid 25 cents times 75 fireworks equals $18.75. Okay, is that right? Yeah. Now, and Jack used to pay 75 cents times 75 fireworks, which was 50, once again, try to avoid doing mathematics mistakes, $56.25. And that up to the $75 we need for the fireworks. Now, if Ava lies, she pays 50 cents for 50 fireworks, or $25. Well, look what's happened. She's paying more for fewer fireworks. Meanwhile, Jack is paying 50 cents for 50 fireworks, or 25. Jack is getting 2/3 as many fireworks as he got before, but paying less than half as much. So by lying, yes, Jack gets fewer fireworks, but he shifts the cost of paying them to Ava. He pays less than half as much as before, but still gets 2/3 as many fireworks, which he may be happy with. Okay? So basically, the point is there's incentive for Jack to lie. Because by lying under the Lindahl equilibrium, which assumes truth, he shifts the cost of financing to Ava. She ends up paying more for fewer fireworks through his lying. Well, therefore, of course, she knows that, so she's going to lie, and you end up with it unraveling. Okay? So the first problem is an incentive to lie. There's an incentive to lie. There's a preference revelation problem. There's no incentive to give your true preferences. Okay? That's the first problem. The second problem with Lindahl pricing is preference knowledge. Lindahl assumes that everyone knows exactly what their demand curve for fireworks is. That's pretty hard. I don't know what mine is. Okay? This isn't like a demand curve for apples where I kind of have a sense of it. I don't really know what my demand curve for fireworks looks like. So it's a standard problem we talked about last time with contingent valuation, which is preference knowledge might be incomplete. And the third that we've skipped over by this two-person example is preference aggregation, which is this is an all well and good society of 2 people. What about a society of 360 million people? To implement Lindahl, we'd love to go to every American and ask them a bunch of questions. How much do you pay for each firework? We have to do it quickly enough so we can put it together and implement the decision where people start to change their mind. They might feel differently in May than they do in October. Okay? So basically, essentially trying to use a Lindahl mechanism for things like fireworks and national defense and welfare spending and the size of our health insurance system would be untenable. Okay? The aggregation problems are nightmarish. Okay? So basically, Lindahl, it shows you what you would need to, in theory, implement the Samuelson mechanism. To implement the Samuelson rule, in theory, you need very unrealistic conditions. So that's a good starting point, because in practice, we're going to then say we're not going to get to the optimum. There's no way government can actually implement the optimum. So the question is, how close can we get? All right? Questions about that? So this is sort of an extreme, just like I talked about in chapter 8, just like we assume the government knows how to measure costs and benefits, but there's a lot of noise around that. We also assumed in chapter 7 that the government can appropriately represent preferences. Well, there's a lot of noise around that. So what do we do in trying to do that? Well, the next step is we say, what about, well, if we can't do Lindahl, what can we do? Well, it's hard to ask people their demand curve, but we can have people vote. Should we have fireworks or not? And so the next step in our schematic is to think about direct democracy. Say, fine, I'm not going to ask all Americans to trace out the demand for fireworks. I'm just asking them to vote. And the majority decision wins. And in fact, direct democracy is a long-standing feature of US government. Indeed, the first colonies operated by direct democracy, okay, through town meetings in New England. Indeed, there's still town meetings. In Vermont, for example, in the 1970s through 1990s, more than 1/5 of all Vermont residents participate in a town meeting. So there's active town meetings throughout New England, but it's a pretty small way we make decisions. It used to be the major way we made decisions. Rather, direct democracy still exists in the US through state referenda and initiatives. These are when you go to vote in many states, you don't just vote for a candidate, you often vote on topics, the referenda initiatives. So a referendum allows citizens to vote on state laws or constitutional amendments that have already been passed by the state legislature. So if something's already been passed, you can have a referendum on it. The other is, but much more frequent, are voter initiatives, which allow citizens, if they get enough signatures, to actually put something on the ballot for the public to vote on. Okay, and voter initiatives are quite popular. 24 states allow such initiatives since the first ones in Oregon in 1904. 2,600 have been on state ballots and 41% have passed. And most initiative activity is concentrated in a few states: Arizona, California, Colorado, North Dakota, Oregon, and Washington, although we have initiatives here in Massachusetts as well. So it's something that many states do, and it's a wide variety of topic. And it's waxed and waned in popularity. So in the early 20th century, initiatives were very popular. And they were used for things like taxation and other things. Then starting in the late 1970s, voter initiatives started to be used again to change property taxation. We'll talk about this a lot in chapter 10. Started in 1978 with Proposition 13 in California. And a number of states passed propositions to limit property taxes. And in recent decades, voter initiatives have been used to tackle social issues. Marijuana legalization is often an initiative that's been on. Gay marriage is a state initiative that's been on. Increasingly, I think abortion may be a source of state initiatives. And generally, tobacco taxes, smoking regulations, it's basically increasingly used as a source. There's ballot initiatives on should Uber drivers be allowed to be defined as independent contractors, or should they be regular employees? There's ballot initiatives on all sorts of things that go on all the time, and that's an example of direct democracy. Okay, so the question is, how well does direct democracy work, or how well does majority voting work? Really, direct democracy is they're always on the ballot. The majority wins. How well does majority voting actually work? Okay, so then we have to ask, what does work mean? What does it mean for majority voting to work? Well, what we want to do is have a specific definition for what we mean for a system to work. And that is a system that works, aggregates preferences consistently. Consistency. So we're going to define as good voting system, one that works, as one that aggregates preferences with consistency. What does that mean? Okay, that means it meets three principles. Okay, what is consistency? First is dominance. That is, if a choice is preferred by everyone, then it must be chosen. That's the dominance principle. Pretty uncontroversial. The second is the principle we always impose on everything since we're kindergartners, which is transitivity. A feature of all math proofs since the beginning of time, which is if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, A must be preferred to C. Okay, so standard transitivity condition. The third is a little more interesting. Just as in 1401, we had these standard conditions, I added non-satiation as the new interesting economic condition. The third condition here is what we call independence of irrelevant alternatives. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. What does that mean? Independence of irrelevant alternatives means if one choice is preferred to another, then introducing a third irrelevant alternative cannot change that ranking. Okay, so if I'm voting over erecting a statue or building a park, okay, and then suddenly there's a third alternative to build a police station, okay, that's sort of irrelevant to whether I like statues or parks better. My underlying view about statue versus park should not depend on whether the police station's on the ballot or not. Now, I might like police station better than either or worse than either in the middle. That's fine. But my ranking of statue versus park should not depend on whether police station's on the ballot or not. Okay, yes. So in other words, the point is that if I ask you, we're going to spend money a certain way, would you rather we spend on a statue or park? You're going to have some view. They say, oh, wait, I forgot. There's a third option, which is a police station. You might say, I like a police station best, or second best, or third best. But it shouldn't affect how you feel about statues versus parks. So
if I say I like statues more, and then there's a police station, I like police station close.
Yeah.
I should never go police station, park, statue.
Yes, exactly. You shouldn't reverse your preference across statues and parks. Okay. So those all seem pretty reasonable. Yeah. Individual level. Good question. So those seem like pretty reasonable assumptions. And it turns out that those are pretty reasonable assumptions, but it turns out that they're going to end up causing some trouble. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about an example where majority voting works to solve those assumptions, and one where majority voting meets those assumptions, and one where it doesn't. Okay, so to do that, let's go to a particular example. Let's think about a town that's thinking about how to fund its schools. And the key thing is there's 3 levels of funding: low, medium, and high. The key thing is each level of funding comes with an associated level of property taxation. Low funding means low taxes. High funding means high taxes. The medium's in the middle. Okay? And let's think about 3 types of voters. The first type of voter is parents. Okay? Parents, they care about school quality a lot. So their first choice is high. Their second choice is medium, and the third choice is low. Okay? They just want the best school quality. They're happy to pay the taxes to have it. The second group is selfish elderly people. Selfish elderly people, they just want low taxes. They don't give a shit if the school's good. So therefore, this goes low, medium, high. The worst for them is to have high taxes. In the middle, we're going to have a young couple without children. They're sort of not sure. On the one hand, if they're going to stay there and have kids, they want the schools to be good. If they're not, they want to pay a lot of taxes. So for them, we're going to say medium's the best. They like medium the best. Okay? They like medium the best. If their second choice is low, because they can always move, their third choice is high. They don't pay high tax in a place they might even send their kids. So this is not a proof. This is just I'm making up sensible preferences. Okay? So these are the preferences we have. And we can represent those preferences in table 9.1. Okay? And we assume each of these 3 groups are a third of the population. And table 9.1 shows those preferences. Okay? Now, suppose the town is going to hold a series of pairwise votes over funding level. What that means is they're not going to vote in all 3. They're going to vote on one versus the other. They're going to have basically a semifinals and a finals. Okay, so a series of 3 pairwise votes. So for example, let's say the town first votes on H versus L. What wins? L wins. Why does L win? Who said that? Yeah, why? 2% voters prefer L. Okay, so H beats L. What about H versus M? Who wins that? Go ahead. M, because 2/3 prefer that. And then, so H beats L. I'm sorry, L beats H. M beats H. So let's do L versus M. Who wins that? M wins that. Questions about that? It's just what's preferred by 2 out of 3 people wins. Okay? So in that case, M's the winner. In fact, I didn't want to do a trick on you. Any order I do these in, M would win. M's the winner no matter how you set up this series of pairwise votes. M always wins. M is is the preferred option. Okay, so majority voting worked in the sense that it's transitive. Okay, we don't know dominance because it's not a dominant option. Okay, and so, I haven't showed it independence of relevant alternatives, but trust me, it holds here. Okay, now let's make one change. Let's say the young couple actually decides to move out, and they're replaced by a couple that's considering private school. Now, the couple that's considering private school has different kinds of preferences. The couple that's considering private school their first is they want low property taxes and send their kid to private school. Their second choice would be high property taxes and send their kid to public school. The worst for them is medium, because then they pay pretty high taxes and get a mediocre school. So their preferences, we replace them in table 9-2. Replace the about to have kids sample, parents, elders, young couples. It should be, yeah, there's a typo here. It should be parents, elders. Yeah, so private school parents, shit. Okay, so the first column's right. Yeah, the columns are right, but the last column, young couples, parents, elders. Yeah, it should be named parents, elders, young couples. It should be parents. They replace elders, but they shouldn't have replaced the elders. Oh, no, they should. Okay, that's fine. No, they replace that's fine. Doesn't matter. Replace the elders. You're right. That's okay. So they replace the elders with these people. Okay. So now let's look at what happens when you vote. Okay, let's run a competition. Okay, let's do H versus L. Who wins that now? H versus L. What wins that? L. H versus M. H versus M. Okay, H wins that. Okay, L versus M. M wins. Transitivity has been violated. Okay, transitivity has been violated because H is better than L. H is better than than M, but L is better than M. Let me see if I did this right. H versus L. Did you get the first answer right? Yeah. Okay. So basically, you can't get a consistent answer here. And indeed, whatever order we set up this votes, you're never going to get. If I set these votes in a different order, you're going to get a different answer. So basically, the bottom line is you're not getting a consistent answer here in this case. Okay, so when we replace one type with another type, you no longer get a consistent answer. Okay, and so basically, what that means is whoever set up the votes could get the answer they want in the order they set it up. So, for example, suppose someone wanted low spending. What would they do? Well, they first set up M versus H and have H win. Then they'd set up H versus L, in which L would win, and say L was the winner. They'd stop. Okay, but they'd be wrong because they'd have missed the fact that actually L is not always a preference. If you do L versus M, M's going to win. So by setting up the order you want to do votes, you can change the outcome. That is not a consistent voting mechanism. Okay, because that does not satisfy transitivity, because you get different outcome. Indeed, this is even got a name. It's called cycling. Cycling, that the order you set the votes up in delivers different outcomes. Okay, so what's going on here? What's happening? Well, in fact, we've just done a casual proof, and if you want to have a nightmare, you can do the formal proof of what's called Arrow's impossibility theorem. Arrow's impossibility theorem, named after the Nobel Prize winning economist Ken Arrow. Arrow's impossibility theorem states that there is no rule in the world that's ever been thought of, and it could be thought of for voting, that ever and always would deliver a consistent outcome with majority voting. That for any preferences you write down, you can always think of some way to break majority voting and get an inconsistent outcome. except if you just have a dictator announce it. Okay, but that's not democracy anymore. But as long as you let people vote, Ours impossibility theorem states that there is no voting mechanism that can consistently aggregate all possible types of preferences. You can always write down a type of preference that'll break the voting mechanism. So, you know, we always use different voting mechanisms. Maybe in my dorm, they use points. They weighted votes by points. There's the ranked choice voting we talk about in Maine and other places. None of those are fully robust. Someone smarter than me could always make up a kind of preferences that would cause inconsistent outcomes with any voting mechanism. Yeah. Say it louder, please. Is this still true? I guess that's a good question. If you did all three in one round, usually we just think of voting across two things. I don't know quite how to think about that. It's an interesting question. I'm pretty sure it's always true because it's like a theorem and all. But I don't know how to prove it casually for the case of three options. Yeah. I mean, the problem with one round is you get a tie here. You could get a tie, and I don't know how to handle that. Right? With pairwise, you can't get a tie. Yeah.
Like, what exactly does it mean that, like, with some voting mechanism, you can't get a consistent outcome? Because, like, here, it doesn't seem like the voting mechanism really matters. It's like it's already not transitive, right?
Yeah, but the point is that, and I don't know if this is true, but someone smarter than me could probably think up a voting mechanism for these sets of preferences. You got a consistent outcome, but then you can make up another set of preferences that break it. The point is that there are a million possible voting mechanisms out there. Okay, from ranked choice voting we've learned about to weighted voting, etc. Arrow's theorem says you can never come up with one that a clever person can't break with the right set of preferences. That's all he's saying. Okay, this is a pretty big problem. Because if we want to use direct democracy, we'd like voting to be consistent. So one way that we've solved this problem, there's two ways to resolve this problem. One way to resolve the problem is to have a dictator. That's sort of unattractive. The other is to ask, is there a broad class of preferences for which Arrow's impossibility theorem doesn't hold? That is, is there a broad class of preferences where majority voting does consistently aggregate preferences? And it turns out there is. It turns out as long as preferences are what we call single peaked, then majority voting works. It consistently aggregates preferences under various voting mechanisms. What does single peaked mean? Basically means as long as it's the local maximum is the global maximum, you're good. Okay? So basically, take a look at figure 9.2. Jesus. Yeah, figure 9.2. Okay, in figure 9.2, okay, this is a way of representing people's preferences. On the y-axis is utility. On the x-axis is the different options. So for example, in the first example, parents' utility rises, the green line's upward sloping. As spending goes up, parents are happier. As spending goes up, elders are sadder. So the purple line's downward sloping. And the young couple, they were sort of happiest in the middle. Each one of those curves is single peaked. Compare that to the red line in the second panel. That's not single peak. Both G and I are local maxima. Okay, those are non-single peak preferences. And that's why we broke the mechanism in the second example, because preferences became non-single peaked. So as long as preferences are what we call single peaked, then the mechanism works. What does that mean in practice? Well, in practice, what it means is the following. It's sort of like about irrelevance of, it really comes down to this part of the definition, which is that as long as there's not sort of a private option that can substitute for the public options, you're good. What screwed up the third model was the option of a private school. As long as they're sort of voting across different things governments can do, people's preferences tend to be single peaked. It's when you say, well, you can buy your way out of the government that people start to have non-single peak preferences. So that's the kind of examples where non-single peakness arises. That's not a general proof, okay? But that's sort of the intuition of thinking about it. Yeah.
For low, medium, and high taxes, you can sort of order them in a clear way. For like statutes,
well, I mean, for school, you can order them in a clear way, right? you spend more in school. I'm talking about that in chapter 11. But let's presume more school spending means better education. Let's make that assumption. I think for police, you do the same thing, which you spend more on the police, presume they do better on crime. Okay. For statue, it's harder. Like, I guess bigger statues we like better. Okay. But once again, you're right. I mean, that's another complication, is sort of the ordering isn't always obvious. But for most things we'd vote on, national defense or education or healthcare, as long as more spending means better, okay, you can get a sense of that ranking. Where it breaks down is at some point I say, well, more spending is better, but at some point spending gets too high, I want to opt out of the system altogether. Well, that's like the private school parents, and that's where single peakiness can break down. Okay. So what we're going to do now is assume single peakiness. Okay. We're just going to assume that kind of, it's a more typical example. This is kind of the way we move forward with political economy theories. We sort of say, look, arrows and possibility theorem is a pain in the ass. Let's get around it by just assuming single peakiness and move on. Okay. But it's important to understand this is an assumption we make. Okay. However, what's nice about that assumption is not only does it cause the impossibility theorem not to be a problem, it also delivers an incredibly simple result, which is what we call the median voter theory. The median voter theory, which is that if preferences are single peaked, not only will voting yield a consistent outcome, we can tell what outcome we delivered simply by looking at the preferences of the median voter. That is, if we as long as we can line everyone up by their preferences, we don't need to know how they feel. As long as we know their ordinal rankings, then we can find the guy in the middle and say, what do you want? And that's what's going to win. It's actually pretty powerful if you think about it. I mean, it still requires a lot. I need to know people's rankings. But if I took everyone in this room and their views on Lizzo, okay, and had someone from person who loved the most, and they'd pay $1,000 to go see her, to someone who hates her would have to be paid to go see her. Okay, that person has to leave. Okay, then basically, hopefully my other recommendations please you. I can basically say, well, look, I'm going to find this. Let's say there's 53 of you in this room. I can find the 27th person. Okay, and I can say to that person, okay, I can say to that person, how do you feel about Lizzo? And they'll say, I'm willing to pay $200 or $150 for Lizzo tickets. And I'll say, well, basically, if tickets are less than $150, you should go. This class should vote to go. If they're more than $150, the class should not vote to go. Okay, and that would win the vote. Now, 26 students will be unhappy, but 27 will be happy. It's majority voting. So all I need to know is the middle person's preferences, and I can decide whether it's a good thing to do or not. It's incredibly powerful if you think about it. I still have to get your ranking, but I need to know how much you hate Lizzo and how much who loves Lizzo. Wow, you're kidding me. You guys are killing me, man. All right, whatever. How much you love Lizzo, I don't need to know. Okay? I just need to know the rankings. And I can deliver the outcome by knowing the median voter. Okay? That is incredibly powerful result. But it's also, which says that, so the median voter theory states that with single peak preferences and direct democracy, the preferred outcome will be the one preferred by the median voter. But that's a positive conclusion, not a normative conclusion. The normative conclusion is, well, is that an efficient outcome? And the answer is not necessarily. The median voter will be a stable, consistent outcome, but why might it not be a consistent outcome? Let's take the example we just did with Lizzo. Okay, let's say the 27th person said, let's say tickets were $149, and the 27th person said $150, so I make the class go. Why is that inefficient from a Samuelson perspective? Yeah.
Maybe there's like one person who like really doesn't want to go, that like really outweighs everyone else.
Right. In other words, remember the Samuelson condition is that not that the median MRS equals marginal cost, but that the sum of MRSs equals the marginal cost. What's the difference? The median versus the mean. If we have a purely normal distribution where the median and the mean are the same, then the outcome will be efficient. But if we have heavy tails on one side or another, so the median is not equal to the mean, then it will not be efficient. In other words, the median voting theory does not represent intensity of preferences. There's no accounting for intensity of preferences. As a result, in my Lizzo example, okay, we would end up, if somebody loved her especially and 27 person didn't like her, or vice versa, it'd be inefficient. Okay, so as a simple example in the book, so suppose that your town recognizes what a superstar you are and they decide to build a monument to you. And they go to everyone in the town and say, let's vote on whether we should have this monument. And let's say that the monument is going to cost, let's say that there's 1,001 voters in your town. And the monument is going to cost $10,040. It's going to cost $10,000. I'm sorry, the social marginal cost is $40,040. My bad. So what we can do is by charging each person $40, we can finance the monument. So we want to know, is the monument worth more than $40 or not? So we're going to have a vote. And people line up. And let's say that 500 of the voters say, I don't know who that kid is. I'm paying 0. Okay, 501 of the voters. And 500 say that kid's a stud. I'm paying 100. Okay, well, 500 times 100 is 50,000, which is bigger than 40,040. So the monument should be built, but it won't be because the median voter doesn't like you. Okay, doesn't respect you. Okay, so the bottom line is intensity of preferences is required to properly evaluate the Samuelson condition, but it's not being reflected in a median voter because you really care about the mean voter. Okay, questions about that? Okay, now let's move on and let's talk about, so we talked about unanimous consent, how that would actually work. That would implement the Samuelson condition, but the problem is it's sort of unrealistic. We talked about direct democracy. Under certain conditions, you can get consistent outcomes, but they won't necessarily be efficient. So now let's move on to what we really do in most of the world, which is representative democracy. Okay, which is what we actually do is we don't vote on things, mostly vote for people who vote on things. That's the way most of the world makes decisions. Sometimes it's informal village councils in developing countries. Sometimes it's more formal legislatures in developed countries. But the bottom line is most decisions are not made by direct democracy. Most are made by representatives, elected or not. Okay, so let's focus on developed countries where we have elected representatives. And let's ask, how does that change the model? Well, it turns out that under certain conditions, it doesn't change the model at all. So in particular, if preferences are single peaked and politicians are vote maximizing, then we replicate the median voter theory with a representative democracy. If preferences are single peaked and politicians are vote maximizing, then the preference of the median voter is still what will happen. That's still what you'll get. To see that, just look at figure 9.3. Let's say there's two politicians, Joe and Donald. And let's say they're fighting over one issue, which is defense spending. Let's say that's the only issue in the election, defense spending. Okay. Joe and Donald fighting over defense spending. And let's say that Joe wants low defense spending at J1 in the first row. Donald wants high defense spending at D1. Okay. If they take, and let's align all voters along a line, literally every American's along a line, from those who want to spend 0 on defense, those who want to spend 50% of GDP on defense. Okay, I presume there's some people who want to spend more 50% GDP. We'll just leave them alone now. Okay, so some line, and people represent along that line. So if Joe and Donald take their positions in panel 1, they'll each get 25% of the vote. People will vote for who's ever closest to them. 25% will vote for, they'll each get half the vote. Okay, half vote for Joe, half vote for Donald, because they'll vote for who's ever closest to them. Well, recognizing this, Joe could move slightly to the right and win. Joe could say, wait a second, if I move slightly to the right, the guys on the left aren't going to vote for Donald, and I'll get some people around the middle. So if I move slightly to the right in the second row, Joe wins. Well, Donald could say, wait a second, if I move even more to the left, then I'm going to get more votes than Joe. Okay, and that will continue naturally until they both are at the middle. Because any other outcome leads the other guy winning. Okay, questions about, before you start criticizing this, I want questions about, do people understand why under the condition I laid out, or the condition of this example, we end up with the median voter being the deciding voter. Okay, this is the idea of the swing voter. The term the swing voter is what we call the median voter in America. Okay, questions about that? Okay, now let's take some pot shots at why this model isn't realistic. Yeah. So there's a number of problems with this model. The first problem is non-voters. Not everyone votes. Now that problem is sort of easy to model. You just make this line voters. Okay, so you then want to split, you then want to take the median position among voters, which actually the truth is, okay, that's true. But let's just sort of assume to first order who's going to vote is not determined by that. Then that doesn't change the model, it just changes how you draw the axis. What else? What else is wrong with this model? Realistically, yeah.
More than 2 people.
Yeah, so once you have more than greater than 2 candidates, this thing falls apart. If you do 3, it cycles, just like our other example over there. You never get a stable outcome because one can always move and block out the other one. Now, once again, so non-voters I'm not too worried about. Greater than 2 candidates for the US, I'm not too worried about. We always have 2 candidates, well, at least when the elections get to the end stage. So these are not fundamental criticisms, I think, of why this model doesn't work in the US. But what are some more fundamental criticisms? Yeah.
I mean, there are still, well, first there are primaries in the US that push the candidate more towards extreme, and also the candidates themselves have a policy preference. They're not
right. So there might be ideology. Candidates, this is kind of a crude measure of vote max, sort of an offensive measure that all candidates care about is maximizing votes. That's terrible. I care about doing what's best for America. Okay, so the notion is that candidates might actually believe something, and that belief might matter. Okay, this is a very transactional model of how politicians behave. That belief might matter. Certainly if ideology matters, that's going to matter. What else? Yeah. Yeah, there's you guys are killing it. Multiple issues. And so and these issues might be correlated. So I go into the right on one issue, I may lose voters on that issue, but get voters on another issue that people feel more intensively about. Say if I mean to the right on defense, yeah, I lose the defense, but I get all those, I get all the pro-choice, anti-choice voters that care about a big defense. It's also correlated with your feelings on abortion, and those voters I get. So with multiple issues, this also gets more complicated. What else? Yeah.
There might be like different like affiliations, so it might not really be only looking to voters to consider it.
Who else? That keep. Yeah. Well, lobbyists, but in particular, this is sort of assumes a sort of one person, one vote. But in fact, one might want to denominate this x-axis in dollars. Okay. In some sense, a vote that getting several $1 million for someone might be worth more than getting a vote from someone else. Okay, that money matters. And therefore, we don't necessarily want to, if we're not in a sort of situation where all individuals count the same in terms of their preferences. Individuals who have money to contribute, their preferences matter more. Even if only one vote, they can pay for ads that can influence other votes. So that's another problem. Yeah. Oh, it's just a silly example. Yeah. Yeah. Right. There's both measuring and knowing preferences that people might not know. They might not have full information, might not understand. That's a challenge. Yeah.
I guess like this relates to like the actual outcome. Like they don't actually have to deliver on their outcome once they're elected.
Well, that's a separate, yeah. I mean, that's a separate issue. You'd like to think in a dynamic game, if they didn't deliver, they'd be punished. But that's sort of a separate issue. But the point is, there's lots of problems with this model. Okay, you guys have really hit the highlights. There's lots of problems with this model. Okay, and so it's not at all obvious the median voter will out. Okay, Theoretically, they could, but in practice, there's lots of reasons why the median voter wouldn't win in the US. We all have the swing voter model, but we just discussed a number of reasons why the swing voter model may not hold. Okay. Now, but the other point to make is, let's say all these things wash out, and let's say the median voter model does hold. Well, then we have another problem, which is that's not necessarily the efficient outcome. And here we come to everybody's favorite whipping boy, but perhaps shouldn't be, lobbying. The term lobbying comes from the fact that Ulysses S. Grant was a known drunk, and he would sit in the lobby of the Willard Hotel across from the White House every afternoon and get drunk, and people would come ask him favors, and he'd say yes, because he was drunk. And that's where lobbying came from. Okay. Lobbying is something which is definitely a derogatory term in the US. The idea is that people are getting things they don't deserve or distorting our political process. But in fact, it's important to understand theoretically, lobbying is exactly the opposite. Theoretically, lobby's fixing exactly what's wrong with the median voter model, which is the way to represent intensity of preferences. Absent lobbying, the median voter model delivers an inefficient outcome, because if someone cares a lot, their vote only counts once. But if they care a lot and lobbying moves the needle, then that's a way to represent intensity of preferences. So the key point about lobbying is, in theory, it's doing exactly what we'd want it to do. In theory, lobbying is a way to bring intensity of preferences into the system. Okay. Lobbying also plays another important role that nobody talks about, which is when you're in the political world and you have to decide about lots of things you don't know about, lobbyists are actually a great way to learn. So as long as you understand where they're coming from and you hear from both sides, you can actually yourself quite well educated on a topic by listening to lobbyists from both sides. They actually provide an important information function. Okay. So in theory, lobbyists are good. In practice, of course, they might go too far. So in practice, of course, so an optimal model of optimal lobbying would be lobbying would offset the failure to represent intensity of preferences. But suboptimal lobbying would be it would more than offset the failure to account for it, and actually would over account preferences that actually aren't that intense. Or over, in particular, we think the problem with lobbying is that it leads to a situation where a few people with a vested interest can get outcomes that may be not socially efficient. So for example, is a project that will benefit 100 people by $1 million each, but the remaining 260 million citizens will have to spend $100. So clearly that's a bad policy to have, right? If 100 people get 100 and 260 million people lose 100, that's bad. But if those 100 people lobby and 260 million people don't notice, then it might pass. So that's overly representing intensity of preferences. So the question is sort of, does lobbying can push us past the point of efficiently representing intensity of preferences to the point of overly representing intensity of preferences? And there's probably no better example of that than foreign policy in the US. Okay. I don't know how we come from farm country, but in 1900, 35% of all workers in America were working on farms. So only 120 years ago, 1 in every 3 workers were farm workers. Today it's 1%. Okay. Yet we spend $22.4 billion a year subsidizing this sector. A huge amount of money we spend subsidizing this sector. Okay. We do it in a couple of ways. One is we send money directly to farms. The other is we have price supports. We artificially inflate the prices of certain goods to make sure that they can indirectly subsidize those farmers. Okay. Funding farms costs each American household about $144 per year on average. So each and every household in America pays $144 on average. The average farm gets $16,000 in subsidies. But in fact, that's not really representative, because in fact, the vast majority of the money goes to a small share of very large farms. So most people say, is this a way to support family farming? Anybody argues for farm subsidies to support family farming, but that's not true. The vast majority of dollars are concentrated in subsidies to a small number of large corporate farms. Okay. So basically, the question is, so in 2019, the top 10% of farms received on average $560,000 per year, while the bottom 80% received on average $8,000 a year. So 10% of farms get most of it. And the bottom line is that most of the people who work these farms earn more than $100,000 a year. So it's basically not going to poor family farmers, it's going to large corporations. Now, why? Well, why is because those large corporations lobby effectively and the rest of us don't notice the $144. It's also true that the state of Iowa, which is an important farming community, holds the first in the nation primary or caucus. So politicians have to kiss up to the state of Iowa as part of running for president. So we have a situation where lobbying has delivered an inefficient outcome. We're paying $22 billion a year for each family spending $144 for an outcome that benefits a small number of rich corporations that are in the farming business. Okay, that's not just the, by the way, we'll talk uniquely about how screwed up the US politics is a number of times in this class, but this is actually even worse in other countries. So the European Union spends about $113 billion a year supporting its farmers. Japan spends, so the average European cow, literally every cow in Europe on average gets $2.33 in subsidies. Okay, in Japan, there's $47 billion in subsidies. And the world overall, we think there's about $320 billion in direct subsidies to farmers, a lot of which actually ends up being lost to corruption and other sources. So it's really just a classic case of lobbying doing a bad job of what lobbying in theory could do well, which is represent intensity of preferences. Okay? Questions about that? Okay. So that is how we talk about representative democracy. The question is, well, what's the evidence? In some sense, the key question is, well, to what extent is this assumption of vote maximization true? To what extent does, there's a lot of problems with this, but a lot of problems with every theory we teach in economics. The question is, they describe the data pretty well on average. And the answer is many things in this class is there's a lot of power. So for those of you who've taken, how many have taken 1432 or no regression, learn regression analysis? Wow. Okay, well, then I can't use this analogy. But basically, if we think about testing economic hypotheses, okay, there's two questions you can ask. One is, how much of the world is explained by that hypothesis, or what statisticians call the R squared of the regression? And the other is, does that hypothesis significantly affect behavior, or what statisticians call the t-statistic of the explanatory variable? So basically, with many things we'll do, they can explain the world well, yet they have significant explanatory power. It's true for the median voter model as well. The median voter model clearly is not the right description of the entire world, but it actually has a lot of power behind it. So for example, what happened is every 10 years, congressional districts get redistricted. So boundaries get redrawn for our 435 congressional districts. Some states lose congressmen, some states gain them, the boundaries get redrawn. So what this study did was they looked at what happens when the median voter changed in a district as the boundaries got redrawn. So let's say I represent a district where the median voter is a conservative Republican, and then the boundaries get redrawn, so the median voter now is a moderate. Okay. It turns out that in that case, I changed my voting behavior. I'm the same guy with the same ideology and the same preferences. But it turns out when your district's redistricted to be a different set of people, you actually do vote differently. So in that sense, people do respond to who the median voter is. There's some level of vote maximization going on. Okay. So clearly people care. The swing voter is not irrelevant. People do care. On the other hand, it clearly doesn't explain everything. Yeah.
Sorry, so you vote differently if the median voter in your district?
Yeah. You vote in Congress differently.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the congressional representative. No, the congressional representative votes differently. The representative of those people votes differently. Sorry, I wasn't clear on that. So congressional representative changes how they vote in Congress based on the composition of their districts, which is consistent with the median voter theory, right? The median voter district changes and the representative representing that district changes how they behave. On the other hand, there's lots of evidence inconsistent with the median voter theory. Perhaps the best example of that is the fact that many states have senators from two different parties. If the median, and yet senators are elected by a statewide vote. So if the median voter theory was true, you would never have senators from the same state voting differently on things, but they do all the time. Okay, clearly it's not just the median voter that matters, or senators from the same state would always vote the same. Okay, and perhaps one of the coolest evidence here that actually ideology does matter in the end comes from a study my former student Abanya Washington did, where she looked at random variation in the gender mix of politicians' children. given a completed fertility number, the gender mix is random. And she showed that politicians who had daughters, all else equal, were more likely to vote strongly for women's rights issues. Okay, conditional on number of children. So politicians had 2 daughters and 1 son, more likely to vote more strongly in favor of women's rights issues than one had 1 son that had 1 daughter and 2 sons. Okay, that clearly is not because it's the median voter theorem. There's nothing about the median voter in that distinction. Clearly, ideology matters and personal preferences matter. Okay, so basically, the median voter matters, but it's not dispositive. One of my favorite pieces of evidence the median voter matters is that vote maximization matters. Is there something in Congress which is called earmarking? The process of earmarking is basically saying, I'm going to, when there's a bill passed, I'm going to add $1 million for a lab in my state or $1 million for a road in my state. And people say, fine, we'll let that go to get your vote. Okay. And it was often hidden in the political process. So to try to fight that, some sort of congressional reformers said, you know what? That should have to be public. People shouldn't be able to hide anymore if they put $1 million for their local thing. They should have to face the voter. And you know what? Politicians loved it. They're like, great, I can advertise now. Guess what? I gave $1 million to my local gym. People love it. They vote for me more. So politicians weren't ashamed of it at all because basically they care about trying to buy votes. Vote maximization matters. Okay. So basically, there's clearly evidence for the median voter theorem. There's some evidence that shows it doesn't explain the whole world. And that's the thing about economic theories. The question is, do they have explanatory power? Yes. Can they explain the whole world? No. Okay. Now, questions about that? Yeah.
Having senators from different parties from the same state be explained by them being elected at different years?
Could be explained by them being elected in different years. But once they're in office, they shouldn't vote any differently. Unless they can predict that 2 years from now, unless they have different future predictions, future predictive abilities, once they're in office, they shouldn't vote any differently. Okay, good point. Okay, now, until about 6 or 7 years ago, that's where the lecture stopped. Okay, but this lecture is increasingly irrelevant, and we cannot ignore the fact the American political system has changed in a fundamental way and has become increasingly polarized. And so I want to spend the last little while here talking about polarization in America. Not the last little while, we'll come back to the last topic, but on this topic, representative democracy, we've got to talk about the increased polarization in America. And that's represented really by figure 9.4. Okay, figure 9.4 shows a polarization score. So what this means is it's basically they take all, this is done all the time, they take all the votes politicians take and score them on a ranking of liberal to conservative. Okay, some are hard to score, some are easy to score. You know, abortion votes are easy to score, tax, defense and tax are easy to score, voting for clean energy is easy to score. Other things are sort of harder, but basically it's things which line clearly along on the conservative liberal spectrum. And what this line shows is the percent of each party that votes more or less conservative. So above the line is conservative, below the line is liberal. And what you see is Republicans are always above the line, Democrats are always below the line. That makes sense. Where Republicans are conservative, Democrats are liberal. You'd be worried if it was, you'd be weird if it was the other way. But what's striking is to look at the gap between the two, which started out very wide in the wake of the Civil War, narrowed considerably in the post-war period, and has widened considerably in the last, say, if you follow the lines, really the real action's been sort of, it's been sort of in the last, say, since about the early 1990s or late 1980s. There's been a considerable widening, and that considerable widening has been largely driven by the red line. Okay, likewise, you see it in the Senate and the top and the House of Representatives in the bottom. That really, I mean, if you look at the break, really looks like it dates more to about 1980. Okay, you see starting in about 1980, the end of a period of convergence and the beginning of a period of divergence across the parties, mostly driven by the red line, going up faster while the blue line's falling a little bit. Okay. In fact, we are now the worst developed country in the world in terms of polarization. Studies that have compared us to other countries have either experienced a decrease in polarization or a much slower increase in polarization. And in fact, what's more significant is not just it used to be different issues. What's worse even now is just differences actually on interpretations of the facts. So for example, when asked in 2021, during, not the absolute peak of COVID, when COVID was still a significant problem in our country, or actually in late 2020, so when COVID was still in its prime stages, asked, is COVID a very big problem for our country? 37% of Republicans said yes, and 73% of Democrats said yes. Now, here's something which is killing thousands of people a day. Now, I think the answer is obvious, but even if it's not obvious, it's weird to think two different groups could think that differently about a fact on the ground, okay? Or an opinion of that magnitude. So the question is, what's going on? How have we become such a polarized society? And I want to offer several hypotheses, but I'd love to get your views on these and other things that might be going on. Okay. And really, if you're interested in this, the best book to read is Ezra Klein's recent book about polarization in America. Ezra's the best political writer on the web, and he wrote a very good book about political polarization. And basically, the main thing, his main theory, is that what's happened is a growth of what he calls tribalism. That basically, political party has become the defining cultural characteristic in society, much as race or gender or religion used to be. Okay, so here's an amazing fact. Okay, in 1960, 49 in 1960, the vast majority of Americans, I don't have the fact here, were opposed to their child marrying someone of a different race. Today, only 10% of Americans are opposed to their child marrying someone of a different race. That's pretty amazing. That's incredible progress. In 1960, only about 5% of people were opposed to their children marrying someone of a different political party. Today, 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats are opposed to their child marrying someone of a different political party. Think about that. Republicans are 5 times more likely to say they don't want their child marrying someone who's a Democrat than they say they want their child marrying someone of a different race. Okay, that's stunning. And it sort of speaks to what's happened of party as sort of representation of culture in our society. Okay, and basically it's driven a large part by what Ezra Klein calls effective polarization, which is basically people feeling very negatively about the other party. So these things called, you don't have to write this down, it's in the book, and it's all just sort of making the same point over and over again. But basically, they have these things called feelings thermometers, which are like, how do you feel about people? And, you can say, I really don't like them versus kind of, I love them, and sort of a scale like that. And basically, if you look at people, how people feel about people of their own party versus another party, the feelings thermometer difference was 27 points in 1978, and it's 46 points today. And it's grown faster and is larger than any other country in the world, or any developed country in the world. So we have an incredible polarization that's driven through a party identity. So that's one hypothesis, or one factor. By the way, it's not like there's one, these are all true, I think. You may disagree, I'd love to hear that. But these are all true. But let me give you sort of the 3 leading hypotheses, okay, or 4. The second hypothesis is it's the media's fault. Is this the media's fault? Okay. Basically, in the few decades after World War II, all Americans got their news from the same source. Basically, Walter Cronkite told everybody what the news was. Okay. But that's been replaced. And basically, now Americans can choose from, a quote in the book, now Americans can choose from hundreds of partisan news sources, many of which care more about arousing emotions than hewing to journalistic standards. The proliferation of sources interacts with the most notorious problem in human cognition, confirmation bias. People rarely seek out evidence on both sides before making a decision on moral and political matters. Rather, they begin with their initial belief and then seek out evidence to confirm it. Okay? Now, this polarization, once again, I think empirical evidence suggests really grew with the introduction of Fox News and Fox Media. Okay? And there's actually empirical evidence. This isn't just my liberal bias. There's actually empirical evidence on this. Okay? One of the coolest studies that was done in this was a study. So the question is, well, does Fox really change people's views, or do just people who are right-wing watch Fox? Well, that's a hard thing to distinguish, right? Right-wing people watch Fox, but is Fox causing them to have that view or not? So there's a really cool study which did the following. They noticed that if you look at people as they watch TV, as they turn on the news after dinner, it tends to be that they start at the bottom channel and work their way up. What that means is if your TV channel is towards the bottom, people are more likely to watch it. Just an empirical fact, turns out. Well, it turns out where Fox is basically randomly distributed around the country based on when Fox came in and other random factors. So basically asked, well, if Fox is in a lower slot in your channel directory, it turns out more people watch Fox and more people vote Republican, all else equal. Okay. In fact, the effect is so big that they predicted that basically the 2004 election, which George Bush won by several percentage points, would have been won by John Kerry, absent Fox News. And Obama, who sort of won moderately in 2008, would have the greatest landslide in American history if it wasn't for Fox News. Okay, so this is a meaningful effect. This, of course, gotten worse because now social media has become the dominant way people get their news. Okay, in 2020, 71% of Americans get their news from social media, which basically echoes people go on social media sites which often echo their beliefs. And as we know, the social media news feeds are set up to do that. As you know, the way social media operate, the way social media companies have set this up, I mean, they're private maximizing companies. I don't begrudge them this. This is what they should do. They have algorithms which try to get you to click the most. And what those algorithms find is effective polarization or getting hot under the collar about an issue makes you click more than liking an issue. So basically what they do is if they find you're clicking on a divisive issue, they send you many, many more recommendations on that issue. And it sends people down these rabbit holes. Okay, there's evidence of that over and over again. So basically the proliferation of news through social media has expanded misinformation and basically different views of facts on the ground. Okay, so basically if you ask people about basic facts today, you get very different answers. Okay, so for example, you know, when you ask people when they wanted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which was going to get rid of Medicaid coverage for millions of people, and you asked folks if it would, Democrats correctly identified it wouldn't, Republicans said it wouldn't. Okay, despite the fact objectively, the facts were it would. One of my favorite facts here is if you ask people their feelings about the state of the economy, this is a stunning, I should have this graph in my book actually. It's a stunning graph. Right before the 2020 election, Republicans thought the economy was on a great track and Democrats thought it was on a bad track. Within 1 month of the 2020 election, nothing's changed, guys. Republicans thought the economy was on a terrible track and Democrats thought it was on a great track. All the change was who was going to be president. Nothing changed in terms of economic fundamentals. Okay, this is very worrisome. And this is largely driven by where people get their information. Okay, so that's the second factor that's driving this. The third factor is basically what we might call minority rule, which is we no longer have a system in America where the majority rules. Because fundamentally, we've set up a system that empowers minority rule. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean three things, okay? The most obvious one is the problem with our electoral college, which is, as we know, the way people are elected for president is not by the popular vote, it's by the electoral college vote. Each state gets a number of electoral college representatives. And the way it's set up is that smaller states are vastly overweighted. So basically, I think that so a vote for president cast in Wyoming counts 4 times as much as a vote cast in California. So someone in Wyoming gets 4 times the power someone in California does because the way the electoral college is set up. Okay, so that's a perfect example of minority rule. Now that doesn't necessarily cause one bias or another. In fact, we sort of students of modern politics are trained to think the electoral college is biased towards Republicans. It wasn't that way, actually. 34 years ago, the electoral college was actually biased towards Democrats because a lot of these small rural states were Democratic states. Now it's flipped, it's biased towards Republicans. So it's not necessarily one side or another, but it's clearly a bias. Okay, so that's one problem. The second problem is the fundamental structure of the Senate. I don't know if we have Hamilton fans here, but you remember the great compromise discussed in Hamilton, which is that basically the only way to get the South to sign on was to not have a purely representative legislature, but a legislature which gave each state equal rights, have a House of the Legislature which gave each state equal rights. So the House of Representatives has one vote, has population weighted voting. The Senate does not. Each state gets 2 senators, regardless of how big the state is. Okay. What that means is that basically by 2040, 30% of Americans will be responsible for 70% of the senators. 30% of Americans will elect 70% of the senators in the US. So this is, once again, minority rule. That basically it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to pass something when the other side has 70 senators. So essentially 30% of Americans will control the Senate for the foreseeable future, unless we change the way the Senate is structured. And then finally, we have the problem of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the problem that when we draw districts for representatives, they are chosen often by state legislatures, not by impartial bodies. And those state legislatures are controlled by one party or another, and they want to draw the boundaries such that it favors that one party or another. So let me give a simple example. In 2016, Democrats in Pennsylvania won 48% of the popular vote, but only 23% of the House seats. How's that possible? Half the voters were Democrats in Pennsylvania, but only a quarter of the representatives were Democrat. Why? Because the boundaries were drawn in a way to ensure that the Republican legislature could maximize Republican votes. Well, how do you do that? You do that by what's called cracking and packing. What is cracking and packing? Cracking and packing is basically the policy of dividing up constituents such that you end up with every district being like 55% in favor of one party. Or in other words, you take all, if there's heavy Democrats, you put them all together. So one district, the Democrat wins by 90 to 10, but all the other districts, the Republicans win 60 to 40 or 55 to 45. Okay. Indeed, it's actually a great thing. It's actually statistical evidence introduced before the Supreme Court in this topic. It's very exciting. A political scientist at Wisconsin created something called the efficiency gap. So he defined something called a wasted vote. A wasted vote is a vote that is either for the losing candidate or any vote above 50.1% for the winning candidate is a wasted vote. Okay, if you vote for loser, you waste your vote. If the winner won by more than 50.1%, you also waste your vote because you could stay at home. Okay, so he creates the efficiency gap, which is the difference across parties in wasted votes. In a fair system, wasted votes would be equal. In a fair system, everyone would win 50% or whatever to be equal. Okay, but in fact, the efficiency gap was so big in Wisconsin that it actually ran a computer simulation and 200 times ran 200 possibilities for the ways you could draw districts in Wisconsin. So the way districts were drawn and calculate the efficiency gap, then it led 200 alternatives for drawing districts. And in no case could he find one with as big an efficiency gap as the actual districts in Wisconsin. They literally had drawn to maximal efficiency gap maximizing. They drawn it to have a lot of Democrats pooled together in places like Milwaukee, where the Democrats won 90 to 10. So those other 40% of votes were wasted. And then Republicans in place where they won 55-45. So the 45% votes were wasted. So basically, he proves statistically that this is a completely biased system. The bottom line is in a gerrymandered system, politicians choose their voters. Voters don't choose their politicians. And that is backwards. And that's what another aspect of minority rule. So let me stop there. Why don't I think I've raised some interesting issues. I'd really love to discuss them with you. So why don't we start next time? I want you to think about these issues we've raised. Let's start next time with a bit of a discussion of polarization. Did I miss some theories? Am I off of some theories? Anybody got solutions? I'd love to hear them. And then we'll come back and talk about the last topic, which is the last topic we're going to cover, which is government failure. And then we'll move on to chapter 10. So Carter, bring the handouts for chapter 10 as well.